Lumix have finally announced the successor to the S1R, and I can confidently say that it's the best camera they have ever made. You're going to see a lot of videos on this camera today, and I don't want to waste your time, so let's just get straight into the stuff that you care about. The S1R2 will retail for £2,999, $3,299, or €3,599 body only. And when you hear what they've packed into this camera, you'll realise how insane that price is. At the heart of this new body is a brand new 44 megapixel sensor, allowing for 8K video up to 30 frames per second, 5.9K up to 60p with no crop, and we also now have 4K up to 120 frames per second, again with no crop, but let's pop a pin in that for now. The S1R2 has AI phase hybrid autofocus, and Lumix are claiming that you can pull 14 stops of dynamic range from this sensor with the new dynamic range expansion feature, and I'll be testing how well this works later in the video. You can record 5.8K ProRes RAW HQ internally. They've added false color to the selection of exposure tools. There's front and rear tally lights, 40 frames per second blackout free burst rate for photography, and the HDMI output lag has been improved substantially. And that's just the beginning, so stick with me and let me walk you through every single feature in this camera in a little more detail. I'll leave timestamps in the description as always so you can find the info that you're most interested in. Please also bear in mind that the unit I've been testing came with pre-production firmware, so any niggles are still to be ironed out before final shipping. Firstly, let's look at the physical changes compared to the original S1R. The Mark II is 20% smaller and lighter than its predecessor, sharing an almost identical form factor to the S5 series cameras, but don't let that put you off. It definitely feels more premium, with a slightly deeper grip, lockable dials, a dedicated switch for changing between photo and video shooting, and the brilliant tilt and free angle 3-inch LCD screen that's extremely similar to what we saw in the GH7 and the S1H. The dedicated photo video switch is genuinely a game changer for me, as it allows you to have a completely custom function button set up for both stills and video. You can also configure entirely different custom modes for each discipline, and you can switch between your custom configurations with lightning speed. Despite the smaller form factor, the S1R2 still has a 5.76mm EVF, and it's absolutely gorgeous to use. The body is also dust, splash and freeze resistant, as I learned firsthand during my time testing it in Tromsø with less than ideal weather. You now also have the option to close the shutter when the camera is powered off, protecting that 44 megapixel sensor from dust when changing lenses. The S1R2 uses the same BLK22 battery that we've seen throughout the S5 series and the last two GH cameras. In fact, my S5 2 cages fit the S1R2 with no issues really, so that should give you a good idea as to how similar they are in terms of size. There's a single CF Express Type B slot and a single UHS-2 SD card slot, and this makes total sense considering the vast array of internal recording codecs that are available, some of which boasting extremely high data rates. You can also record with the USB SSD function, so if you wanted a more cost-effective media option while still exploiting the highest quality possible, then that's a great route to take. The lock lever from the Mark I flagships has found its way onto this smaller body, and this can be configured to lock any dials or buttons that you find yourself knocking unintentionally. They have also redesigned the port covers, and I much prefer it to the S5 2X style. One of the recurring complaints about the other S-series cameras was the HDMI lag, but now with the S1R2 it looks to be improved. There's also a whole new way to monitor your video feed using the brand new Lumix Flow app, and this is something I'll cover in a separate video, but before you rush off to find out more, stick around here because there's still so much to talk about. The original S1R was definitely more photocentric, and even though they've positioned the Mark II as a hybrid, it still comes with some amazing improvements for photographers. The 44 megapixel sensor produces stunning images with incredible detail and gorgeous colours. 44 megapixels allows you to crop without compromising image quality, and this makes the hybrid and crop zoom features remarkably useful. We first saw these functions inside the S9 before it was brought across to the S5 series quite recently. However, the 24 megapixel sensor in those cameras made it quite limiting. But now with 44 megapixels to play with, you can now extend the focal range of your zoom lenses without worrying about softer, less detailed images. Here's a few more sample images I've taken with the S1R2 over the last 2 weeks. It's been a joy to use for stills, with snappy air performance and great colour straight out of camera. The increase in resolution is definitely noticed when viewing on a 4K monitor, and surprisingly the file sizes aren't too crazy compared to the 24 megapixel Lumix bodies. The high-res photo mode allows you to capture 177 megapixel stills in both RAW and JPEG by combining multiple images together, and this will be incredible for landscape photographers looking to capture as much detail as possible. The burst rates are also improved with a maximum of 40 frames per second using the electronic shutter, and there's also a 1.5 second pre-burst option to ensure that you don't miss the shot. You can capture up to 70 RAW and JPEG images simultaneously before you reach the buffer limit, so that should be more than enough for grabbing a fast moving moment. The S1R2 is also fully compatible with Capture One, so studio photographers will have no issues when using this camera in their tethering and post-processing workflow. Now let's talk about the video features in a little more detail. Thanks to the 44 megapixel sensor, the maximum video resolution is 8K at up to 30 frames per second. I'm not too fussed about 8K to be honest, and I definitely won't be shooting in 8K exclusively, but it will come in handy for cropping in post. In fact, the 44 megapixel sensor allows for 4K live cropping, and that's a feature I've always loved in Lumix cameras. For those who may not be familiar, the live cropping function allows you to set a start and end frame, a clip duration, and then when you press record, the camera will utilize the full width of the sensor to produce a push-in, pull-out, or slider shot depending on how you set your frames. This feature was great in the S5 series cameras, but your final output was limited to 1080p because of the lower resolution sensor. Here's some sample footage that I shot around London using a variety of different resolutions and frame rates in camera. I found myself gravitating towards 5.9K 50 and 8.1K surprisingly, with a little bit of 4K 100 chucked in for good measure. I normally shoot in 5.9K the most with my other Lumix cameras, so I reckon that'll be much the same for me with the S1R2. My overall experience using this camera for video so far has been brilliant. It definitely delivers more than enough sharpness and resolution for my tastes, and the various frame rate and codec options won't leave you pining for anything more. There's a mixture of gimbal and handheld footage in this sequence, and I'll tell you more about the in-camera stabilization improvements in a little bit. I also shot all of this footage in Vlog and graded it using the neutral phantom LUT as a base, so if you're a fan of the colours then definitely check out those conversion LUTs. I'll leave a link in the description. Lens-wise, I used the Sigma 28-105 f2.8 and the Lumix 16-35 f4S Pro, just in case you are wondering. There is no pixel binning when shooting video at up to 4K 60p with the S1R2. Instead, it utilizes the additional resolution available from the sensor and therefore increases both the image sharpness and quality when outputting at lower resolutions, such as 6K or 4K. We were also told at the pre-disclosure event that 8.1K OpenGate video will be added with a firmware update later this year, and that will be extremely useful for creating vertical and 16:9 versions from the same clip. The extra resolution will also allow you to shoot wider, and therefore will make the process of cropping for socials way easier. The APS-C crop in frame rates above 60p and 4K has now finally been removed in the S1R2, so you can record up to 5.9K at 60 frames per second in full frame. There is a 1.17 times crop in 4K 120 however, but it's only minor, and the same thing happens when shooting in 4K 120 on the Sony a7S III, the FX3, FX6 and A1 Mark II, so Sony boys can just back off, okay? There is also a very minor crop in 4K 60 FPS, and Lumix tells me it's about 1.1 times, so again, not much at all, and definitely way better than cropping down to an APS-C image format. The 4K 120p is line skipped however, so instead of cropping into the center of the sensor to only capture the resolution required, it skips lines of pixels while still utilizing the majority of the sensor to help the camera's processor handle the 120 frames it's capturing per second, which on an 8K sensor would definitely be a hard task. The trade-off is a slightly less detailed image in higher frame rates, but the upside is a less severe change to your field of view. You do lose subject detection when shooting in 4K with frame rates above 60 FPS, and instead are limited to full area or single point AF modes. And while we're on the topic of autofocus, the phase hybrid AF seems to work identically to what we've seen in the S5 II and the S5 IIX. It's able to lock onto and track a moving subject without any issues, and I haven't discovered any pulsing when shooting in frame rates at up to 60p. The AF performance in 4K 120 frames seems a little more hit and miss though, so I have to do a little more testing to get to the bottom of this, and then I'll get back to you. But for the most part, it does just fine. The S1R2 is said to have the best IBIS yet, rated for 8 stops of stabilization, and Lumix are saying it's 60% more efficient than the IBIS seen in the S5 II and S5 IIX. Here's some side-by-side shots for reference compared to the S5 IIX, shot with a 2470 S Pro with no stabilization added in post. These shots were taken handheld, walking on uneven ground, and from my initial testing, I think the differences in the IBIS performance are minor. The new cropless E-stabilization mode allows you to add a little bit of digital stabilization without compromising on the field of view. And as you'd expect, it's not as powerful as the standard or high E-stabilization settings, but it definitely is useful for those wanting just a tiny bit of a boost without cropping in. You'll probably also be able to notice that the colours coming out of the S1R2 are quite different from the colours from the S5 IIX, and I much prefer the way this new sensor handles skin tones. Again, I'll dive deeper into the colour science changes in a separate video, so definitely keep an eye out for that. You'll be able to record 32-bit float audio if you pair the S1R2 with the DMW XLR2 module, so it really leaves nothing to be desired for working videographers. You also have the ability to record Proxy files simultaneously, and that's super useful for post-production workflows where the footage needs to be shared between multiple people, or if you're using a computer that would struggle when editing at full resolution. A new picture profile has been introduced in the S1R called Cinelike-A 2, and it's designed to match the ARRI Rec 709 color space. The results are amazing, and this could become one of my favourite profiles to use for video. I'll be diving deeper into this profile in a separate video, so if you are interested then definitely subscribe and be ready to binge watch the fountain of content I have coming out on this camera. I also did an overheating test in 8K with the S1R2 with the out-of-the-box fan cooling settings, and it performed brilliantly, running out of battery before it even had the chance to switch off due to excessive heat. The warning triangle popped up at around the 50-minute mark, but it still kept on recording until it pushed past the hour and switched off due to battery depletion. Now onto the dynamic range expansion feature, and Panasonic are saying it helps to boost the overall dynamic range to 14 stops, so I decided to test and compare the results. Here's a comparison of two different clips, one with the DR expansion switched on and the other with it switched off. When you expose your shot properly, you probably won't notice too much of a difference between having it switched on and switched off. And now here's a test shot in a studio environment where I pushed the footage to its limits. As you can see, the sensor does a pretty good job when you overexpose a shot, regardless of whether you had the DR expansion setting switched on. If you look at the waveform when you push it to 3 stops over, you can see how the DR expansion holds onto the highlight information much better, but with the expansion feature turned off, it flatlines at the top, which means that you've clipped your image. You will see a color shift when you underexpose regardless of the DR expansion setting, but it's fair to say that the image gets slightly more mushy with DR expansion switched off. To be honest though, the differences aren't major, and I'd always recommend exposing as best as you can in camera anyways. It's also worth noting that when you have the DR expansion setting switched on, that your rolling shutter performance will get worse, so definitely keep that in mind. As any long-time watchers of this channel will know by now, I like to dive as deep as I possibly can on everything inside a new camera from Lumix when I have the opportunity. So if you are interested in picking up the S1R2 and you're not already subscribed, make sure you do so you don't miss out on some valuable information in the future. The S1R2 will be shipping from March 2025, so if you are interested in this camera then you won't have to wait for long until you can get your hands on one. I really hope you enjoyed this comprehensive rundown of the S1R Mark II. I've worked incredibly hard on this video to make it as detailed as possible and to ensure that I've covered everything that you may be interested in at the point of announcement. Please leave a comment below if you do have any questions though, and I will be making a lot more content on this camera, so please be sure to subscribe if you haven't already done so. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.